Palingenesis by Simon Harewood. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 13, Ancient Allies. If it had not been Brennick that brought this wild tale to his ears, Lund would not have believed a word of it. The two wide-eyed boys had sought him out in the distribution hall where bundles of clothing and blankets were being given out to Viran not in the host. They fell over each other in their excited account of fire in the crystals, of jewels crawling over the floor, of strange music and magic words. And through it all was repeated the name of that Viran boy who had met them on the outskirts of the destroyed Tur city. They grabbed him by the arms to have him accompany them. Their insistence was impossible to shake off, though he had a task to perform here in the hall. Whatever had inspired their state of agitation had to be witnessed firsthand. Brennick took the lead, still dragging on his sleeve as if he was afraid Lund might change his mind. Bryn came trotting behind, still chattering away, till Lund wondered where his natural reserve had gone.
We helped him. There wasn't enough room in the cavern, even though he took up all the floor. Now it's outside, in the passageway. Oh, the colors! You have to see it.
Lund suddenly grew suspicious.
What cavern are you talking about?
The one where we put the gems from the ghost cave. He's talking to them, and they listen to him.
They rounded the corner and halted, Lund in consternation, the boys in something akin to reverence. Ahead of them the passage widened in front of the doorway leading to the cavern of gems. In this space he could discern the figure of the boy. Around him bloomed at intervals a display of greens and blues, purples and ambers, while there was a corresponding shift in the shadows round his feet. A voice spoke out at regular intervals, in the tone and pitch of its owner, but with an unfamiliar inflection. An echo followed each enunciation, the soft harmony of a gentle breeze through hollow reeds, as if in confirmation and acknowledgment of a command. Lund took a few halting steps forward, leaving the boys frozen in place behind him. Gareth seemed not to notice their presence, or at least was not distracted by it. The words continued, and the shuffling and music that followed them, permeating the gloom with mesmerizing color. Lund glanced at the floor. The gems were set out in patterns, reflecting each pulse of light as the stars in the night sky. Carefully, so as not to disturb the unfolding construction, Lund approached till he stood at Gareth's shoulder. He saw the staring eyes, the rapt expression, coated in the intermittent glow. A child standing next to him, yet reaching beyond time and space as a conduit of truth. At length the strange words ceased. There was a sigh of satisfaction in the half-dark. Gareth stepped into the dim shaft of light falling through the doorway of the cavern. He looked up at Lund. There was a serene smile on his face. His voice now had lost a peculiar quality.
The jewels, you see? I found them.
His eyes fixed their stare on the jeweled amulet momentarily illuminated on the youth's chest. There was a flicker of joyful recognition.
Oh, you will want the rest of that septalion.
Lund glanced down at the shiny object.
The what?
The set you are wearing. You carry the first 2 stones already.
He remembered the moment in the Ronin pit when the spear flung from behind had failed to injure him. The strange amulet and the gem in his blade were somehow connected with that miracle. Here, then, was someone who could unlock those secrets.
You have them here? How many are there? How do they work?
Gareth laughed at his sudden eagerness.
I will fetch them for you, and you can see for yourself.
Janos paced up and down, his face split by a wide smile. He addressed himself to one of the waiting figures.
Didn't I tell you? This child is remarkable. Remarkable.
He shook his head, chuckling.
How that cunning demon Malik could be so blind and foolish as to let him slip away.
The set of jewels still lay in the passageway and adjoining room, inches away from his pacing feet. Rune looked down at the neatly sorted patterns and wondered out loud.
He did not do this all by himself. It would have taken days.
Lund was quick to reply.
You should have seen it. All he did was speak, and the crystals moved by themselves, each into its place.
Veer was completely astonished. He looked around at patterns now familiar, blazing in the light of the wall crystals. He seemed to be speaking to himself.
I knew they brought back the jewels from the south, but I believe the lore that could harness these to be lost. It is only the armor of Fenwith that I could salvage from this hoard.
The sound of running footsteps was heard. Brennick and Run appeared round the bend with Gareth in tow. The latter looked a little bewildered. His hair was disheveled, and he was not wearing his girdle. At the sight of the four men waiting for them, the boys stopped abruptly, at least two of them looking a little guilty. Gareth's voice dropped into the sudden silence.
I'm sorry. I was going to tell you, but I was so tired. I must have fallen asleep.
Veer took no notice of the apology. He strode over to the three, speaking in mid-stride.
They obey you, these stones.
He was pointing at the floor. Brennick and Run retreated, leaving Gareth alone in the middle of the passage. The seer halted right in front of him and spoke in low tones.
Who are you, Gareth? Are you sure you are the son of Rune and Ethera? You are not one of the ancients come back to us.
Gareth looked at him quizzically, not sure whether he was in earnest or not. Since the seer hardly ever changed the expression on his face, it was difficult at best to read his mood. It was clear, though, that he was extremely surprised by this recent development. The amber eyes bore into Gareth's as if they wanted to gaze beyond the visible to what lay behind it. For a fleeting moment the boy was back in Lakeside with the eyes of Elena on him. Instinctively he resisted. Veer took a step back, visibly perturbed. For a fleeting instant he had felt the touch of Kale. He recovered quickly, ignoring the boy's questioning look. His next words filled the passage.
You have done us a great service, Gareth, saith Rune.
He deliberately placed an emphasis on the last words.
Perhaps immeasurable in value.
He looked the boy over, taking in the telltale signs of great fatigue that often accompanied the use of the art. There was much work to be done, but first he had to be seen to.
You may take your rest.
He motioned to Rune.
Go with your father. I will send Sith shortly with a draught for you. Take it and sleep till you wake. When you are ready, the Vadran smiths and craftsmen will wait for you here.
Gareth heard the words with relief. Already his eyelids were drooping again, and the wallights were swimming amid the sparkling sea. Rune was suddenly at his shoulder to steady him as his knees buckled. The man did not wait for further instructions. He turned Gareth around and steered him down the passage the way he had come. The boy sat down on his bed as soon as they reached their quarters. He pulled at the hastily donned surcoat.
You don't think he was angry with me, do you?
Rune did not bother to answer what he considered a foolish question. He knelt down to unclasp the boy's boots and asked one of his own instead.
You sorted all those crystals into sets by yourself?
Gareth gave him a tired smile.
I couldn't help it. I called their names and they obeyed.
Rune placed the boots side by side, took the surcoat from the fumbling fingers, and made the boy lie down.
And these names, where did you learn them?
Gareth closed his eyes. Stars whirled in front of him, a broad wing slowly circling on the hillside.
They are written in the sky when you want to read them really badly.
Rune half expected such a cryptic response. He knew there was no book that contained this knowledge that even the seer no longer commanded. No tutor had brought such insights to a stripling student.
How do you know these things?
Gareth searched for an answer without success. Perhaps there wasn't one.
I am not sure. I just do, like I know my name.
His voice trailed off. Rune sat down on the bed opposite. In a while Sith came in bearing a goblet. Rune shook his head. The boy was already sound asleep. The Vadran merely shrugged, placed the draught on a side table, and nodding to Rune, left the room. Rune stood in the darkness of the deep cavern where he had kept the vigil days before. In this place he knew there would be no distraction or disturbance. Around him the empty silence waited. Deliberately he abandoned conscious thought till he felt as empty as the hole about him, aware only of the life inside him and the ebb and flow throughout his body. There, on the edge of hearing, was the song of the blade in his hand. Slowly the amber glow of the Sear expanded, redefining the lines, unveiling the true nature within. As though in harmony, the gems of the Septalion, embedded in the leather of his wrist bracers, his girdle, his knee guards, and the amulet at his throat, came to life, joining the dull illumination. Now he searched for it with his thought, 7 points of light, in tiny constellations of arcane truth, the laws of creation set out in symbol. He lifted the blade. A blaze of amber circled his throat at once, swirling about his upper body and head. A fiery letter appeared on the chrysolite blade, close to the guard. Here was the place he always stumbled, a fateful hesitation, an uncertainty he could not overcome. Thoughts crowded in. He heard Gareth's tired voice.
Want to read them really badly, like I know my name.
The fire flowed up his arms to meet the construct lying weightless on his shoulders. A second letter appeared on the blade. He trembled slightly. A barrier had been broken. From Grin's Keep to the Tower Lake would take 3 days of steady marching. The main force of the Aronite host trudged along carrying their own rations for 8. The slower transports coming behind would only catch up with them after they had reached Nuria and perhaps Belruth. Evrain stayed with the vanguard, where Ranald, Raelf, and the Inrathian captains were positioned, unwilling to miss any development of importance. When he had met Gareth in this very pass, he could never have imagined that within the cycle he would be marching to the aid of his former enemies. They camped that third night almost within sight of the Tower Lake. There was snow on the hilltops here still, and the fires burned high against the cold. Evrain watched the bright stars overhead and listened to the low Viran voices conversing in their tent. He wished somehow to know what they were saying, to understand what purpose drove these men so loyal to the Wizard of the Sea. Were they not outcasts also from the Nuria they now sought to save? What strange fate would bring the varied enemies of that realm to her aid in this hour? The morning was cold but clear, with the promise of enduring good weather. Most of the veterans in the host marched in silence now, perhaps sensing the strangeness of bearing arms through this pass, without the intention of using them against the Nurians on the far side. In such a startlingly short time, Myrol had become a different place altogether. Evrain marched at the head, the same odd feeling creeping into him. He passed the hideout where he and Lur had first kept the Nurian boy as prisoner. It seemed a lifetime ago. Towards mid-morning, the vanguard entered the hilly surrounds of the lake proper. Ranald and Captain Railf now joined him at the head of the column. They seemed as restive and apprehensive as their men. The marching soldiers rounded a bend and started a slow descent towards the towers. Below them, the waters of the lake lay quietly sparkling in the sunlight. A bird rose from the branches of a sapling close by, sending a call of alarm echoing over the lake. Ephraim blundered into the man who was just ahead of him. The tall warrior from the West March had halted abruptly, apparently without reason. Ranald's bodyguards, close at hand, demanded sharply what the matter was. "Look!" The warrior shoved his gloved finger in the direction of the northern foothills of the towers that were now plainly in view. Evrain saw the shock on the faces of the king and Railf, who recoiled from the sight as though it was a physical blow. The large, bearded captain turned to Evrain in a flash, hissing through his teeth. "What is this, then?" Evrain narrowed his gaze. He, too, felt the rise of sudden panic at the sight presenting itself to them. A host of men, many hundreds strong, and dressed in antiquated armor, sprawled in neat ranks on the high ground directly in their line of approach. Unfamiliar battle pennants flapped over them in the stiffening breeze. It was clear that they were aware of the approaching Aaronites, for they would not sit out there on a desolate hillside for their pleasure. Questions chased one another through his confused mind. Who were these men? What was their purpose here in the pass? Railf turned away with another hiss.
"That comes from trusting these dogs. 600 cycles they have not changed their ways."
Evrain grabbed hold of his arm to restrain him.
Wait!
He pointed in his turn towards the silent host. Two figures had detached themselves from the ranks to stride purposefully in their direction. Two figures at once familiar to him. The man walked with the proud gait of a Viron prince, while the boy at his side, shorter by a head, Evrain would recognize anywhere. It was but a few short miles to the west that he had stumbled upon his silent freezing form 9 seasons before. Ranald spoke close to his ear.
Who are these men? Are they Vadran?
Evrain scanned the ranks ahead. Many figures along the lines appeared smaller than their fellows, but this in itself proved that there were more than Vadran on the hillside.
Some of them, perchance.
Hunnick appeared suddenly at his elbow. His surprise seemed as great as theirs.
"These are Viron. They should not be here. And their colors are all wrong. Wait,
He was watching the progress of the two figures approaching them from the line of shields. A smile suddenly breached his stern expression.
that's...
Yes,
Said Evrain.
I recognize them too.
Who is it?"
Railf still sounded suspicious. Ranald raised a gloved hand to his brow to shield his eyes.
Imran's breath. It's Prince Rune and the boy.
The party started forward without waiting for an instruction. Even the still frowning captain strained forward with the rest, the guards struggling to keep up. Excited shouts rose up all around as they met the two. Despite his former accusations and quick suspicion, Railf was almost drawn into the circle of laughing, hugging, backslapping goodwill. Evrain regarded the boy, who somehow seemed more frail in his embrace, closely, as he did the Viron at his side. Rune had lost the arrogant mask, the angry challenge that used to accompany his every glance. In its place there was the silent purpose of a man who had found himself again. Had he not experienced a similar miracle that Suntide past? Their eyes met, and a little understanding passed between them. Rune nodded briefly and gripped the other's hand. Hunnick ruffled Gareth's hair and patted his cheeks in delight.
"I would have come for you myself, I swear it. Had not the master told us Rune was already on the way."
Gareth knew he meant what he said. He stared up at the man, bright-eyed, and blurted out secrets of his own.
He's my father, honey. My real father.
The Viron looked from one to the other, open-mouthed.
"You mean... you are not Fengor's after all?"
I am not. Did I not tell you?
The child's obvious happiness was a pleasure to behold. All those uncertain days on Heron Inrath he had lived under the shadow of his supposed heritage. Now there was nothing to tie him to the old shameful Nuria, and the man who had hated him apparently without reason. Ranald addressed himself to Rune, interrupting the exuberance.
Prince Rune, glad as we are to meet you again, this mysterious force with which you greet us needs to be explained. I was led to believe the main Nurian host is no longer a shadow of its former self. Did these men march all the way from Gilreth?
King Ranald, a mere 10 days ago, the host you see here did not exist. The soldiers in it are not from Nuria, though they are all Viron. In fact, they and their compatriots who now reside in the towers are living proof of Malik's great deceit and treachery.
All eyes had turned to him. The men listened to his unfolding account with growing incredulity and outrage. The atrocities committed in the Shadow Lord's secret southern realm appalled them, even as the tale of the final resistance and escape filled them with wonder. Raelf frowned at Ephraim throughout, as if he could not quite believe such fantastic exploits. He was searching for a sign of similar doubt in the expression of his fellow captain. Ranald was thinking along far more practical lines. As soon as Rune exhausted the lengthy explanation, he questioned him on the ability of these former slaves.
And are they of any use on the battlefield? Have they had experience or training for such endeavors?
Rune hid a quick smile.
Quite a number have participated in pitched battles in the underground, and I've worked with them these last few days. It is true that many are young and would lack the strength and endurance of Aronite or Inrothian warriors, but there are those among them that possess extraordinary skills that may prove useful against the sorceries of the Swamp Lord.
He motioned towards the hillside where the shields reflected the bright sun.
Why don't you meet them, and you may judge for yourself?
Ranald nodded.
I must confess, I'm most eager to make the acquaintance of such ones as have survived the ordeals that you describe. The very fact that they have progressed to this point is testimony enough of their worth.
The little group formed up again. Raelf muttered under his breath about tricks and traps and the king exposing himself, but no one paid him any heed. As they headed on towards the Viron line, Hanik fell in beside Rune. He spoke in low tones so as not to be overheard.
You had me vowing vengeance against you from Munborg. I feared you did not possess what Lord Kael claimed to see in you. I misjudged you, and I am mightily relieved that I was wrong.
Rune made no reply. He looked into the eyes of the man striding next to him, and remembered the struggle there had been for those buried qualities to be brought to light. If only Hanik knew how close he had come to upholding that terrible betrayal, the man would perhaps not be so gracious with his apology. Lund stood on the cold hillside, watching the party approach. At his elbow stood Berthael, and just behind him the small band with their distinctive colors. The main line of 1,200 was formed a little higher up the slope, bedecked with their newly acquired lightweight armor, the large variety of vagrant shields, the bright spears, and the new bows. At a distance it appeared to be an impressive force, and no one would have guessed that more than half were mere children. Already they could make out the glinting sunlight on the long, snaking lines of the Aronite host, rounding the lake just to the south of their position. The men and boys in the Viron line at his back could hardly contain their excitement, for once the vast numbers approaching them were not aimed at overcoming them. No, these were allies, men to fight by their sides and uphold their claim to freedom. It was an exhilarating, heartwarming sight for young and old. He and Berthael stepped forward to meet the group, inclining their heads towards the man identified by his surcoat as the Aronite king, as Rune had instructed them. Ranald regarded the two with curiosity as they were presented to him by name only, without origin, without regions or towns attached to it. He noticed they were very young, and had about them the look of frank sincerity and unsophisticated simplicity. These were not the Viron he had dealt with before. They were a far cry even from the more approachable ones hailing from Gilreth. The intensity in the eyes of these survivors convinced him more than anything that the incredible tale surrounding their fate was the truth. Lund noticed more Viron among the king's group, men he had not seen before. He met the eyes of the leading man, piercing and bold over a slightly aquiline nose, and to his amazement noticed the tears in them. Even the taller, dark-haired man seemed moved. Were there so few Viran left in the world that such meetings were so highly prized? He would ask Rune about it. The king had extended a hand, and he gripped it warmly. There was real friendship in the man's eyes, real sympathy and goodwill. He decided that he liked the Aranite sovereign. This was someone to be trusted.
We are surprised to meet you here, Lund, but an unlooked-for friend in this hour is a treasure indeed. We shall merge our fortunes in this enterprise and march together against the one who has plotted our destruction.
The youth smiled at such kingly words. His reply was quick and simple.
We came but to aid our brothers. We did not realize they had such friends already.
Ranald searched for intentional irony in the youth's eyes, but there was none. It could well be that these Viran knew nothing of the long-standing enmity between Nuria and its neighbor.
Every man that will stand against the oppressor from Toralon is a welcome ally. Your readiness to face again the author of your suffering is highly commendable. Your brave men will no doubt make a worthy contribution.
The king scanned the line of soldiers directly behind the two. They wore the amber eye of the towers on their black surcoats. Many seemed terribly young. His eyes fell on Rin and Brennick near the center. He pointed at them in surprise.
These are your pages?
Lund seemed puzzled.
Pages.
Messengers.
Rin interrupted.
Yes, messengers, the scouts, and the champions of the Roning Pit.
Ranald raised his eyebrows. He noticed the blade on Brennick's back. The innocent and somewhat frail exterior of these Viran masked a resilience and courage that had outlasted the beasts of Malik's prison. But surely such little ones would simply be trampled in the press of the battlefield. He kept his thoughts to himself. If Aran had found itself in such dire circumstances as those faced by Nuria, they too might have been forced to enlist children. The god who had favored Asar and Heldred's departure from Varys did not seem to take further interest in their venture. The flotilla of boats made slow progress up the coast in near-becalmed waters, sometimes struggling into the slight breeze bearing down on them from the south. Unseasonal fog hampered their lookouts, and everyone remained apprehensive regarding the marauders operating in these seas. In their little craft, they would be virtually defenseless against the slaver galleys and armed pirates. Despite the lack of speed and looming danger, spirits were high among the people after their dismal confinement in the city. There they had faced slow starvation or eventual capture and enslavement as probable outcomes. Sailing away from the fearful place brought on a feeling of reassurance. Perhaps the nightmare that had descended upon them so unexpectedly might be left far behind. On the third day of their voyage, the clouds and fog lifted entirely, and the freshening breeze pushed offshore towards the northwest. The boats dared to put out to sea a little further, still keeping the Queen's shoreline in sight. The desperation of their plight faded. War seemed far away. Seabirds traveled with them for several hours. Perchance there could be some sustenance to be pilfered from such a large number of fishing boats. Towards noon, a reminder of the struggle that had engulfed the shores of the inland sea appeared off to starboard. A huge column of acrid smoke, swiftly dispersed by the wind, obscured the skyline over the land. Haldred realized that they had to be approaching the Nurian city of Ingervall, finally overcome by its many adversaries. The sight was a disturbing one, filling the beholders with dreadful expectation, as if the perpetrators of the deed were able to reach them also from the ashes of the dying city. No doubt the pillagers were sea ravens, swooping down on the weakened coastal communities in the wake of the terrible swarm. How she detested these opportunists, feeding on the calamities of others, gaining from the misfortune and distress of their fellows. It was hard to imagine that Rune had been a captain among them, doing as they did, without regard for the pain and grief they caused. She had never seen him speculating in the slave trade, though. He had been a trader and a smuggler, but perhaps nothing worse. The great headland jutted into the sea ahead of them as the ruins of the city came into plain view. The flotilla would have to turn back south to round it, struggling into the wind once more. Every eye scanned the horizon for fear that the pirate lords were lurking somewhere in the vicinity still, watching for survivors fleeing the scene. The fortress had been set on fire recently, for there were flames visible even from the distance. The sooty smoke billowed out from the rubble, and remains of houses and walls, from the hulks ablaze in the harbor, from the windows of stone towers. There could be no one alive in such an inferno. Soon the smell of it enveloped their boats, and fine black dust painted the flotilla in a funeral shroud. They had turned back north again to round the headland known as Azrith Point, named for the town to the north further up the coast. Haldred wondered if anything of that town remained, or if the ravens had already done their grisly work there too. She drew a sleeve across her brow, looking at the sooty residue. Her journey through seasons past had taken on all the aspects of a voyage through the underworld. Myril was being swallowed up by vengeful and voracious demons who would not desist till all good things had disappeared. She fervently hoped that there was still a refuge in the hand. The boats gathered speed again, running before the wind. They turned almost due north, passing between the rocky formations of the shore and a series of small islands and reefs. There was no sign of pirates, or a similar column of smoke over the town of Azrith. The apprehensive mood abated, giving way to careful optimism. Mayhap the ravens would not operate this far north. It could be that they were content with striking the major cities. There had to be many hundreds of slaves in their cages and pens already. In the gathering dusk, they could make out still the glow of Ingervall's burning to the southeast. The shore ahead appeared calm and deserted. No lights marked the coastal dwellings or fishing piers of Azrith. Either the inhabitants were in hiding, or the sea ravens had been here already. The wind slackened as they came into the bay proper, allowing them a leisurely scrutiny of what lay ahead. The supply of drinking water was almost exhausted, and there would have to be a landing made that night to replenish it. If the place was truly deserted, it would be an ideal opportunity to do just this, since the town wells could be accessed with ease. Sear took in one of the boats to take a closer look. Still there were no lights, no fires, no movement among the buildings and silent structures of the town. The walkways and piers were dark and deserted. The boats overturned on the beaches as if stored for the night. He decided it would be worth the risk. The signal brought the entire flotilla into shore. Everyone welcomed the opportunity to move about on land again, after being cooped up in the cramped confines of the overcrowded boats. Nevertheless, there was much caution and little noise as each boat in turn docked to spill its passengers onto the shore. Sear warned the people not to light fires, or even make use of torches to find their way about. Only the men who were designated to fetch water were allowed to wander away from the boats. All the others could stay for an hour only, within sight and hailing distance, to refresh themselves in whatever way possible. Aldred stood with Pura and Arid on the main dock. They had helped Maris out of the boat and onto an empty crate where he settled gratefully. He seemed much improved, though she had no way of knowing for certain, since he never complained. The breeze was fading even more to a gentle stir, and in the darkness bright stars appeared. She draped her arms round the shoulders of her son, who stood in front of her. He would soon have 10 cycles, she remembered, in Suntide, if ever they reached that season again. He was brave, her little boy, having seen so much of horror recently, witnessing the death of his father and grandfather, and the nightmare of Frey's Point. There were voices on the air, noises of activity and orders given and executed. At first she wondered why the men returning with the water were so careless when they had been warned. Then she realized that it was too soon for them to make their appearance. Perhaps the wells had been rendered unusable. She would welcome a further delay and repose from the jostling, crowded boat. Then she heard Cura take in her breath sharply. The girl pulled on her sleeve frantically, turning around to face back towards the south. The dying wind had shifted direction. The sound she had heard had not come from their men after all. Silhouetted against the stars, the tall masts and sails of 3 ships creeping up on the docks of Azareth grew ever larger as they looked on in horror. Could these be sea ravens? Who else would be venturing about off the Nurian shore at this time? Had they been spotted and pursued after all? She rushed away to where Asar still waited for the return of the men. She called to him in an anguished whisper. He looked up and saw the dreaded shapes looming ever closer. There was little time to make a decision.
There are only 3.
Yes, what do we do? Can we fight them off?
Asar touched his bearded chin.
They are not galleys. There is no sound of oars that should have been there in this light breeze. Also, they carry no lights. Is that because they want to surprise the town? Why are there so few ships?
Aldred was growing impatient.
What do we do? Hide?
Yes, we hide under the walkways and give them a surprise instead.
Quickly the docks and walkways were cleared and the people ushered into the deep shadows beneath. The soldiers readied their weapons. A messenger was sent to recall the men at the wells. There was no deep port here, and the pirates would have to row themselves ashore in boats. This would deliver them piecemeal into the trap. Asar was confident that a sudden show of force would at least scare them off. He positioned himself close to the main pier, though he did not intend to join the fighting. From there he would give the signal for attack and direct the efforts of the armed men. The pirate ships no longer seemed to be moving in their direction. They had dropped anchor. It would not be long now. The last breath of wind had disappeared. Asar could hear the dip of the oars in the water as the ravens approached. Oddly, he could make out only a single boat making its way to shore. Perhaps, with things so dark and quiet, they were sending in scouts first. This tactic would ruin the surprise attack and cost the defenders dearly. It would not be possible to keep all the people out of sight. Besides, their boats and belongings were still in plain view along the moorings. The scouts would have to be dealt with, even if they gave away the presence of the armed defenders. Not even a child stirred or so much as whispered as the boat drew level with the pier. The refugees had learned to be silent through many narrow escapes. Aldred prayed that this would not be their last one. She saw Lauren's light reflecting off the daggers and short swords of the scouts. They were not heavily armed, probably because they did not intend fighting just yet. This would come when the main body landed. She felt a shudder as the boat touched the pier. There was a muffled instruction to tie it to the mooring ring. Only 3 pirates stepped onto the walkway. 2 more stayed at the oars in the boat. These would have to get out to untie the rope if their mates were overpowered. Booted feet marched along the wooden pier. There was conversation in low tones. The men sounded puzzled, but made no attempt to conceal their presence. They walked down towards the waiting ambush in plain sight. Something was wrong with this behavior. They did not act like scouts for an impending raid. Asar also noticed this incongruence. He decided to capture and question the intruders instead of having their throats slit immediately. The three were looking about suspiciously as they passed him. The quiet town would make anyone uncomfortable. They halted a few yards away, all the while conversing as if they were unsure how to proceed. Hussar motioned to his bowmen and stepped out of the shadows behind them.
Good evening, good sirs. A fine night for a stroll, not so?
The men instinctively went for swords and daggers, but he raised a hand to prevent them.
Unless you desire to forfeit your lives right away, please do not touch your weapons.
Several of the archers, with bows drawn and leveled, stepped up around them. The pirates raised their hands, palms outwards, to show their compliance with this request. One took a step in Hussar's direction. From the sound of his voice, it was apparent that he was little more than a youth.
Are you good people from Azrith? Your accent tells me you are not Nurian.
We are not.
Replied Hussar.
Who are you, and what is your business here?
We mean you no harm.
The young man lowered his hand slightly.
My name is Johin from Kerton. I am a Sea Raven Lord from Trax Isles, come to warn the people of Azrith about a raid planned by Zebar of Kilvest tomorrow.
Hussar was amazed at such a tall tale. It took him a moment to recover.
Why would a Raven Lord warn the intended victims of Kilvest? You cannot seriously expect me to believe such an invention.
Join had dropped his hands to his sides by now. His tone indicated that he did indeed expect such credulity.
Not every lord in the Isle supports Zebar or his mad schemes. Since he murdered Rasgent and stole the seat in Kilvest, there has been much resistance to his rule. Most captains only sail with him because they fear his powerful allies. That is why we sneak ahead of his raiders when we can, to warn the people.
Hussar smiled slyly. Here the confident young fool would be caught in his lie.
Oh, really? And who else have you warned? Certainly not Varus or Arus.
There was no hesitation or uncertainty.
Not Varus, no. We were too late for that. But Arus was warned. They chose to ignore us, thinking it's some ploy from Zebar to scare them. Ingerval listened, though. That is why most of them escaped inland before the attack.
They escaped?
Yes. Why else do you think that crazy whoreson burned the entire city? He was so mad to find only a few scrawny slaves for his empire.
Join gave a hearty laugh. And there was an answering snigger from the men behind him.
I'm sure the Nurians are halfway to Lanvir by now.
Hussar was half convinced by this claim. Johin would also not have put himself at the mercy of the townsfolk by marching in like he had if his intentions had been hostile. Furthermore, the Sea Raven might was irresistible along the coast now. They had no need of cloak and dagger tactics to get their way.
What's in this for you, then? You are going to all this trouble simply to spite Zebar?
Join shrugged.
This is the only way we can oppose him right now. He is too strong to move out by voting or even rebellion. You may not realize it, but the Sea Ravens have never been this divided. Ever since Lord Rune left the Isles.
Lord Rune? The Nurian exile?
Hussar sounded incredulous.
You know him?
Know him? He was Lord in Kerton before me. He is the one who nominated me to Rasgent for the position.
Hussar stepped forward smiling, his hand outstretched.
Now why did you not mention that right at the start?
He gripped the surprised Raven's hand and shook it warmly.
Prince Rune's recommendation counts more with me than all the heroic tales you could tell.
He called over his shoulder.
Princess Heldred, here we have a man who is acquainted with the exile.
Join stared.
Prince? Princess? Who are you people?
The Burr merchant slapped him on the back, looking all the while for Haldred.
Any friend of the prince is a friend of ours. We are the remnants of the several nations fleeing before the swarm that has engulfed all the eastern lands, from as far afield as the Waste and Lysan.
Join whistled through his teeth.
It is as bad as all that, then. I thought it strange that there was no opposition from the powerful mainland kings to Zebar's plundering.
Haldred appeared, to Hussar's delight, who exclaimed,
Princess, here is a rare thing indeed. The Sea Raven we can trust. He's a friend of Prince Rune's, and has come to warn the good folks of Azrith that they will be attacked on the morrow.
Haldred regarded the young man closely.
You know the exile.
I do, my lady.
I once had the privilege of saving him from drowning, and he has repaid the favor by saving me from slavery and giving me his position when he left the Isles. I have never encountered a more worthy man, nor near as bold.
Do you know his whereabouts?
Aldred hoped her voice would not betray the eagerness she felt. Johin simply shook his head.
Not since the day we parted off the Tristwood shore. That would be at the end of Hyacinthe last cycle.
Aldred remembered. It had been at that time she had encountered him in Breck. She could still see the flashing blades of that ferocious duel in the palace garden.
But you should not linger here, my lady. The sea ravens will attack at daybreak, and they are angered because of the failure at Ingerval. Where are the people of Azrith?
We have seen no sign of them.
Assar replied.
The dwellings are empty and the town deserted. I suspect they have set off for one of the inland towns. Perhaps one of your Ingerval crowd warned them too.
Join nodded in agreement.
You have to go at once. Are you traveling by sea? Where are you heading?
Aldred and Assar exchanged glances. Perhaps the newfound trust did not extend to revealing their ultimate destination. The merchant replied.
Oh, up the coast as far as we can go. Do you think the ravens will go as far as Eston?
I do not know. It is quite probable that they will go there eventually, but my spies have not reported anything as yet. If I were you, I would not even stop there. It is better to flee all the way to Arran if you can. They will have more mercy on you than the Swamp Lord.
Assar extended his hand once more.
We thank you for the warning, Dohin of Cairton, and will follow your advice. We only stopped here to replenish our water. Within the hour we shall be on our way again. At least we know now where the ravens are and what they are planning. You have done us a great service.
Oh, I can do more than this. I can see you safe up the coast as far as Eston, if you desire.
Again Assar hesitated, looking quickly at Aldred. Did they want this raven along with them? Would he not report their whereabouts and destination to Zebar as soon as he had the opportunity? Then again, if he was with them, he could not lead others after them before they were in a position to make their escape.
Agreed. We can certainly do with your company.
The flight that night was anything but swift. Not a breath of air stirred to aid them on their way. During the hours of darkness, the men struggled against the weak current, taking turns at the oars. Join's ships fared even worse, being towed by longboats and much more susceptible to the current. By the time the imminent arrival of Imran's orb paled the eastern horizon, they were still within sight of Azrith Point. Aldred felt the apprehension of earlier take hold of her again. Any moment now the Sea Raven galleys would appear in the bay, and they were not hampered by the lack of wind as the flotilla and joined ships were. Perhaps they ought to make for shore and hide their boats till the raid was past. She looked across the wide expanse of water between them and the coast. Already it was too late to make an attempt. She strained her eyes in the direction of the point. Surely there were dark shapes detached from the headland, perhaps with masts and sails hanging loose in the unmoving air. No, there were islets off the shore, she remembered. Then she caught her breath. Islets did not move further from the shore as these shapes did. She touched Cura's arm and pointed.
What is that? Can you make something out?
Before the girl could answer, there was a snap behind them as a gust of wind filled the sail of their boat. The newly formed host from the western lands, with their allies in tow, camped on the shore of the Tower Lake that evening. The Viron shelters were makeshift affairs of all shapes and sizes, hastily sewn together for the road to Bel Ruth. The Inrothians used tents borrowed from Aram. All the canvas dwellings formed a sea under the stars. Lund lost his way in the confusion of colors and shapes soon enough. There had been a council of sorts among the captains in Ranald's impressive pavilion. He was left alone after the meeting was dismissed, to find his way back to the tent he shared with Brithael. Only he had no memory of where that tent was, and in the gathering gloom there was no unobscured landmark to point the way. He would have to ask directions. Even the stars had disappeared behind a mass of low clouds gathering in from the north. He turned back to where he imagined Ranald's pavilion was. Certainly someone there would be able to point out the right way to the Viron encampment. Braziers had been lit for the roaming sentries. The pass was a cold passage through the northern mountains, even in Greenswell. Lund pulled his cloak close about him as he searched for the large, kingly structure. A bigger-than-average tent finally loomed up in front of him. There was a brazier in front of it, but no guards in sight. He approached cautiously, and glancing about him, stepped through the opening. As soon as he did, he realized that this was not the king's pavilion at all. The interior was lit by a single oil lamp, and the furnishings were far more austere. Thin pallets were laid out on the ground. Not one of the dozen or so beds were raised like the king's. A tripod of spears stood in the center, and was adorned with helms, cloaks, and gear. Shields were stacked against the far wall. He could make out the design on the foremost one, 2 ears of wheat separated by a sickle. There were small chests about also, and the expected marching packs, probably containing no more than armor and a change of clothes for the man carrying it. He had noticed that some of the Aronite nobles had servants with hand-carts following them among the marching men. There were pages and squires, too, seeing to the comfort of these few fortunates. He took a step or two forward and stood looking about the place, not quite knowing why he found it so fascinating. There was a stir behind him, and someone cleared his throat loudly. He whirled about to stare at the man. It was one of the very captains he had met that day. Raelf was surprised to see someone in his tent, especially since the entire camp was at supper, and since he did not need them, he had dismissed the guards also. He glared suspiciously at the intruder, wondering what would possess any man to think of thieving at a time like this. A pair of very blue Viron eyes stared back at him. Ingrained prejudice leaped up inside him. It was the supposed slave leader, up to whatever shady business for which he had infiltrated the host. He was about to hurl an accusation at the renegade, but something in the odd expression of the man stopped him. It was a disconcerting look, almost disarming in its childlike curiosity. For lack of a better strategy, Raelf became confrontational.
What are you looking at?
His tone was meant to challenge, even to offend. If the Viron noticed, he chose to ignore it.
I have never seen your kind before.
Raelf narrowed his eyes, frowning.
My kind, eh? And what kind is that?
The curious reply came without hesitation.
You are from Aran, the beautiful land to the west.
The Aronite captain was taken aback.
I am? What sort of dimwit are you that you do not know that?
I know not what you mean by dimwit, but a little while ago my entire world was hedged in by thickets and trees, and ruled by the whip of the slave master. Since then I have discovered that not all free men are evil and desire the subjection or utter destruction of my people. Meeting others like that still amazes me.
There were voices outside the tent. More of the Aronites were returning after their supper. 2 stepped through the doorway, almost blundering into Raelf, who backed away to give them room. Lund recognized one of them as Evrain, the king's cousin. On seeing him, this last reached out a hand of welcome. His voice was as hearty and warm.
Well, Captain Raelf, you should have let us know we had a visitor, instead of keeping him all to yourself.
He turned to the other man.
Lur, get us some of those folded chairs, and one for Lund.
It was remarkable that such great men would remember his name. Lund gripped the proffered hand. There was no pretense or politeness in the captain's eyes. This was a man that meant what he said. Railf had retreated to a corner and stood looking on with his customary frown. None of that former hint of hostility remained, however. Lur returned shortly with stools for the company and set them out. Evrain pointed Lund to one of them.
Please, stay a while. I have many questions for you. Have you had your supper?
Lund sat down hesitantly. He thought to excuse himself presently.
No, but I'm certain it is waiting for me as soon as you can direct me back to my own tent. And lose the pleasure of your company, I will send for some food, and you can have your supper here.
He ducked his head outside the tent and rattled off instructions to one of the men outside. Two more Aranite officers pressed past him into the tent. One of them shivered and remarked about the cold. Both of them froze and cast a weary glance at Railf when they saw the Viron sitting there. Evrain returned to his seat and sat down eagerly, rubbing his hands together.
Now then, till the wine and food arrives, why don't you tell us about the fantastic escape from the Dankwood? It is an account I'm most eager to hear.
Lund regarded his hosts for a moment or two in silence. It was a strange feeling, sitting here in this foreign place with men he never knew existed, so far from Grail and the brutality of the tour. He wondered if he could ever convey with mere words the utter despair, the paralyzing fear, the soul-destroying horror of that place. Once the words started flowing, however, and the scenes came to life for the teller and listeners alike, an atmosphere of stunned fascination held all of them captive. They fretted and speculated when he broke off to take his supper, watching impatiently as he enjoyed the unfamiliar fare. Already the tent had filled with neighbors hastily summoned, and the wine flowed freely. Yet even the wine cup stood forgotten by the time he finished his account with the tempestuous demise of Lakeside, the strange encounter with Rune, Gareth, and Janos, and the final escape through the portal. Every doubt about the motives of Malik the Undying had disappeared. The full scope of that great deceiver's scheme had been made plain. No one marveled any more at the claim that the eastern lands had disappeared under that monster's first onslaught. They were all thoroughly impressed with the depth of his hate and the ferocity of his assault on the peoples around the inland sea. They departed in awed whispers, each one regarding the Viron visitor with a newfound respect and sympathy. Evrain shook the youth's hand once more as he took his leave, clasping it a moment or two longer than customary. Railf also seemed to be in a pensive mood, staring silently at the flickering flame of the oil lamp. As they settled down to bed that night, he finally spoke the words that had apparently been turning over in his mind for the greater part of the evening.
Evrain, I must admit, they are different, these new Viron from the south.
Railf looked so serious, Evrain could not repress a smile.
You are right, as usual, Captain. They don't have that arrogance we've come to expect from Nuria, and there is no hatred in their eyes. Truth be told, we have never been at war with them, nor they with us.
There was more to come from the bearded captain.
I've come to understand what the real evil is in Myrol. This ancient from Duralan has done great harm, both to us and to Viron. And it is our own blindness and anger that has made it easy for him to do this.
At least the men were not idle, thought Garrelain to himself as he watched the youthful archers at practice among the trees. These boys and men had certainly shown signs of improvement even since their arrival at the campsite and the battle against the swarmlings. 12 days had passed since that momentous struggle, and not a word had reached them concerning the fate of Belruth. No orders came to advance or retreat. Nothing. It was as though Kenneth had forgotten their existence. Garrelain's faith had been sorely tried. Would it not be better to advance and rescue what was left of Nuria from its horrible fate? Could the forces of Gilreth not benefit from the strong fortifications of the city? By now their scouts had reported that Belruth was invested by thousands of swarmlings, and that Nurians inside lacked the strength to drive them off. Why would they linger here when there were those who needed their aid? Byron stepped up behind him. They stood in silence for a while regarding the training practice. Looking even better. They had gone through the same little ritual every afternoon during the last 10 days, watching the men at their training, passing reassuring little comments when they were filled with doubt and trepidation, pretending things were going according to plan when they had no inkling what the plan was. And here they were at it again. Garrelain had had enough of this game.
What are we doing here, Father? Why do we not simply march to the aid of Nuria?
Byron pretended shock when he certainly had entertained similar thoughts. You know as well as I do that there is no virtue in such speculations. We would not have this host or this opportunity if it was not for the intervention of the Sear. And you can stop your foolish claim that Kenneth is not the Seer himself. Garrelain looked a little amazed at this sudden outburst. Certainly it was a sign that the Count's nerves were stretched to the limit, the same as his. Vairand ignored the look and continued. There are worse enemies than swarmlings to face in the days to come. If we move too soon, we will play into their hands. Garrelain shrugged.
I understand what you're saying, but how can we move too soon? This is the only force that stands between the shadow and domination of the entire East Coast. Should we not move into a position of strength instead of waiting for him here in the open?
Vairand opened his mouth to offer the same arguments as before, but this time he was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger that seemed rather excited. Relieved, he motioned the man forward. What news?
My lord, the scouts have brought in a Nurian who wishes to see you immediately. He claims to be a captain of some sort.
Garrelain was intrigued.
He came from Belruth.
No, my lord, from the south.
What does he look like? Asked Vairand.
He is tall, dark-haired, and well-built, wearing the uniform of the Royal Nurian Guard. He carries a blade, and there were 3 others with him, all Nurians.
Vairand and Garrelain looked at each other, momentarily at a loss. Where is he now?
He is awaiting your pleasure at your pavilion, my lord.
They hurried back with the messenger, their curiosity aroused. Sitting in the grass in front of their tent, several guards standing about them, were 4 figures, one of whom stood to his feet as they approached. Garrelain could hardly believe his eyes.
Malvor, where in the name of Imran did you come from?
The guard captain inclined his head to both men in turn.
Garrelain, Count Byrand, I am overjoyed to see you here, and this great host that I believed had perished outside Storr.
These are all men from Gilbreth, Captain, replied Vairand. The Nurian host was most certainly destroyed, as you have heard. If it were not for the warnings and preparations of Vir the Seer, we would have been among them. Malvor stared at him in astonishment.
Lord Vir, he did warn you of the coming swarm. Only Gilreth heeded this warning.
Garrelain sadly shook his head.
You knew Fengor. There was no reasoning with him. At the risk of being called traitors, we refused to muster with him at Storr. But tell us first how you came to be here. Did the king not send you to the far south? To Lysan?
The captain looked tired. They noticed the lines about his eyes and mouth, as if he had aged much during the last 2 seasons. When he replied, he did not look directly at them.
I have traveled for 6 days with little rest, from Varus and Ligurium with these men.
He motioned to the seated figures behind him.
I was in Prek, yes, and received warning from another source that the scourge was on its way. We made what preparations we could, not that it made any difference. The numbers of the swarm was like the trees in the north camp. Like the ocean, it washed over the city.
His voice trailed off, the vision of the crawling hills, the beasts without number, imprinted on his memory forever.
Agents of other powers at work in the city provided a haven and allowed us to escape. Haldred of Ligerium joined us there. She had seen the origins of this plague and done a heroic deed to harm it. It would have been greater still without her intervention. We traveled north, fleeing the lackeys of the Swamp Lord, gathering a few survivors as we came, including Tregoran and the Queen, though he has since fallen victim to the swarm himself. Ligerium is entirely consumed. Even the most northern towns, Varus and Pernacum, have been taken, one by the Sea Ravens who joined Malik, and the other by the huge army marching up from Tyrallan. I saw the encampment for myself. I could not have imagined such a force existed in Myril.
He looked at them almost forlornly, gauging their reaction.
I would advise you to flee back to your strongholds, back to the hills. You cannot face even the vanguard of that host with the men you have here. We have been betrayed. We are lost without that protection we had of old, that which the priests called sorcery, the power that set old Viron apart from other nations.
To his surprise, they did not recoil from this blatant challenge as expected. Instead, the Count's eyes softened into a look of infinite compassion. Captain Malvor, the Ark you are referring to has been reborn in the East. It is more than mere men you see when you look at the soldiers of Gilreth around you. Caroline laid a hand on the stunned captain's sleeve.
It is true, my friend. These past cycles we have been in secret communication with Lord Karth from Huron Inrath, with Ranald of Arran, and finally with Kenath of the Towers. He has shown us the way back to the Art, the true heritage of the Viron.
Malvor was more than a little stunned. At first he thought the Count and his son had lost their minds. The shock of the great invasion had led them to invention and insane speculation. But the host, so well organized and obviously capable, testified in their favor. He stammered out a reply.
Truly.
The hope that had deserted him in the ruins of Varus was reborn. He looked from one to the other.
I desired only to find a place to die with honor among my countrymen. Such news is too great for me. I am not trained in the art as you. In fact, I have fought against it all my life. I have sacrificed my only son to that cause. I have helped the deceivers to destroy my own people.
He lowered his head as if in shame.
But I will serve in whatever small way I can. Put me in the front line somewhere that I may fall in battle.
Caroline shook his head.
We are not going into battle to fall, and the art that you have betrayed has overtaken you this day. Embrace it now, and your contribution may be greater than you can imagine.
It was a crisp morning on the shore of the Tower Lake. The reinforced host stirred itself slowly, as if waking from a rhyme-song sleep. Everywhere, men were breaking camp and getting ready for the march ahead. The unexpected encounter with Viron on the Tower Lake had lifted the spirits of the entire force. It had at once confirmed the accusations against the Swamp Lord, and served as an assurance of what had been an unimaginable outcome but a short while before, an alliance between Aaron and Viron. The Aaronite soldiers still regarded the youthful newcomers with uncertainty, never having seen them give an account of themselves in battle. Yet there was no denying the courage and tenacity of the Inrathians, who had been an unknown power till recently. It could well be that these escaped slaves were of greater value than their appearance suggested. Ranald, Lund, and Hunnick's host would leave the vicinity of the towers that morning to return victorious or broken. Its path was set towards Belruth, and the confrontation everyone knew would halt the Shadow Lord's forces or allow him eventual overlordship of all the lands round the inland sea. Many of the Viron who were to remain behind and await the result here in the towers had come to see off the army marching forth to defend their right to freedom. Among them were Ceridwen and Lathan, both impressed by the numbers of the men gathered there and the solemnity of the occasion. For the Viron girl who had first seen Lund in the farm clearing, driven to exhaustion under the cruel lash of those who had sworn to break him, it appeared to be something of a final farewell. A heaviness settled upon her that the bright morning sun could not dispel. For once, she wished that all she had within her could be expressed. Certainly, her heart would travel with this man to his destiny in their unseen homeland. Whether he fell or conquered, she would be aware of the moment of truth. A cotton-studded field presented itself in her memory. The incredulity at her laughter, the eagerness to learn, the wild hope he had given her then. She watched as he stood with the captains, a warrior now, who had done great deeds. Around him were those whose lives he had saved, small and great, bound to him with undisguised affection, much like the devotion burning inside her. A voice spoke startlingly close by.
He is a prince among the people, this boy you hold so dear.
She felt her face warming as she turned to look at the speaker. It was the Seer, regarding her with no hint of pleasantry or intrigue on his countenance. She stammered out a reply, at a loss for words.
We all do. We all love him. He has done this thing for us, and without him there would not be a person to escape that place.
Oh, but you have made him that champion he is now, with your sacrifice, your aid, your need of him. He is the embodiment now of your hope, his life and destiny intertwined with yours.
Her eyes brightened, some of the sadness departed.
I know we are linked in blood as well. His thoughts are clear to me, and mine to him. Lund told me that is only possible between close relatives.
He regarded her with surprise.
This pains you?
No, I would rather have it so and be unable to become more than just a companion to him. I mean, the bond of thought is special to me. I would not surrender it for the possibility of...
She shrugged and fell silent. The next question took her by surprise.
Why would you choose one or the other?
We could be brother and sister. I would rather be his sister and love him in that way than to be unrelated and unable to find his thoughts.
The Seer shook his head.
No, it is different with you. There is a gift of perception, commonly called listening, that allows your thoughts to reach even those who are just slightly gifted in the same way, not necessarily kin. And I can tell you, he is not even a cousin to you.
Ceridwen did not know which of the discoveries affected her more.
I am a listener.
She remembered being able to touch the mind of Gareth that first day they had met, and surely he could not be related to her. She had sensed also the pulsing of the art in that strange boy, had been aware of a similar gift in him, even before reaching out with her thought. Veer placed a hand on her shoulder.
You have much to give these people. If there is a tomorrow for them, they will have need of you.
Ceridwen heard the longing, the hope, interwoven with painful uncertainty.
You do not know what will be. You have not seen it.
The Seer shook his head sadly.
It is not permitted to seek visions of the future. If ever they come, it is not by command.
He gave her a slight nudge.
Go to him now. Say your farewell, and tell him what you have learned. No doubt he has thought about it often enough.
Ceridwen gave him a grateful look and hurried off to where the Viron were forming up behind Lund. A touch of that sudden joy spilled over into the ancient as he watched her go. It was a feeling at once unlooked for and distressing, for its rarity was but a reminder of what he had not tasted for time beyond measure. He became aware momentarily of Rune and Gareth standing by his side.
They are Viron, I know this,
Said Rune.
but so different to the people from Old Nuria.
That is true.
Veer replied.
They are untainted by deceit and the lure of ambition, unspoiled by corrupting power and the need to dominate others to preserve the self. These remind me of the very first of the race, when Myrrel gave birth to children of its own expression.
Gareth looked at him strangely.
But I thought...
The seer shook his head, smiling.
Legends and folklore may sometimes obscure truth as well as hide it. There are many things in this world that transpired quite differently from what is commonly claimed.
He turned to Rune, suddenly serious.
I take my leave of you here. I have given you what I can. All the whispers and dreams of yesterday seem to find their fulfillment in this hour. I have become blind. What will unfold now is not for anyone to know till it be done. There is much fear in me, and much hope. Not everything has transpired according to the Shadow's scheme. Remember what I have told you, but listen to what lies within you. Do not hesitate. You know now what needs be done.
He reached out a hand and gripped the one offered in return. For a moment they said nothing. Rune was oddly aware of frailty in the powerful ancient in front of him. Veer spoke once more.
While you are on the road, teach Lund something about control, about striking with strength sufficient only for the immediate purpose. His passion for the people makes him overreach and wear himself out on trifles.
He turned away and walked off without looking back. Gareth watched him till he disappeared from sight. When he turned back to his father, he seemed even more apprehensive and pale than before. A hand fluttered nervously to his throat to linger there unnoticed. Rune felt the welling of emotion reaching into him also. If the boy was struggling, it certainly was not easy for him either. He made an effort.
You can always change your mind and come along.
The boy bit his lip and shook his head. This battle had been fought and won in his mind before the arrival of the sad hour. If he did not go to Belruth, he could not be in the temple to lean over his still body and make that terrible discovery. The dream would not come true. He would not be betrayed by the false hope of altering what he knew would be.
It is better that I stay here. I will wait for you, and perhaps, when it is over...
He broke off, shuddering. Rune dropped down on one knee and placed his hands on the boy's shoulders.
Gareth, I owe you my life and my sanity. You are a part of me, and I of you. That will never change, regardless of what happens in Belruth. We both know the truth now. Wherever I go, through time and distance, as long as I have perceptible thought, you will always be with me.
He straightened up, smiled, and drew Gareth into an embrace.
You have permission to invade my mind whenever you like, though I would much rather have you about the camp as an unpaid servant.
Gareth tried to smile at the pleasantry.
What can I do? I do not even have a blade.
There were tears in his voice. Rune knew that these words had nothing to do with his true reason for remaining behind. A thought broke through the sadness.
I knew all the time that I would have to say farewell to you. But why so soon?
What do you mean? Surely you will see me again.
There was no reply. He felt the small body trembling with the effort to hold back the flood of tears. Did the boy know for certain what he had only recently come to suspect? There would be this terrible regret then, even if he was to see Aethera again in the worlds beyond. He leaned down and kissed the pale hair of his son. In the distance, the long column finally came to life. The host entered the final stage of its long march. Not since he had relinquished all hope of rescue in the dungeons of Nun Merrick did the darkness seem so void and cold to Gareth. He told himself that he was selfish and silly, and he knew that it was true, yet he could not stop the flow of silent tears or appease the great pain tearing through him. Of course, there was no other way. Cale, Veer, his own dreams had confirmed that there was no one who could do what his father had to accomplish. Certainly it was better that he could mourn here already in the dark, and that the news, only a few short days hence, would not find him hopeful and unsuspecting, to crush him with the terrible truth, the final outcome of all his searching, all his longing. He turned on his side and hugged the pillow to himself. He would keep all those memories, all the fragments, good and bad, from the very first dream to the last clinging thought of farewell that morning. He would not allow a moment of it to fade, ever. He awoke late the next day, feeling dull and empty. Surely there were no more tears to cry. He got up reluctantly and walked over to the stand to wash his face. Now that the final hours had arrived, the waiting game would start. Perhaps the echoes of that far-off struggle in Uria would find him here in the dreams he dreaded. And then, finally, oh, God forbid, there would come the touch of a dying man and the last fleeting farewell. He dressed himself slowly, purposely turning his back to the empty bed opposite his. There was nothing he needed to do this day, nowhere he could be of use. He would wander about from here to there, looking for nothing in particular. The place was abandoned now, somehow forlorn, despite the 5,000 Viron filling the hallways and empty chambers. How alone he was suddenly, how unbearable the vacant seat at the dinner table. Gone was the bright happiness so recently stumbled upon. The cheerful hope brought on by the mere presence of his father had disappeared completely. The faith inspired by all the dreams and portents now deserted him also. All that remained was the dread certainty that the one who had turned at last would find his destiny in the turmoil around Belruth. There would be no return.